So the cognitive approach or the ecological approach also depends on thinking about mental representation. Mental representation is really a way to think about the internal processes we've been talking about. And mental representations free an organism from relying on the direct and current perception of their environment. So memory, inferential reasoning, forming categories of different objects. That's a predator. That is one of my same species. Insight, where you're able to realize when you see something happen that maybe that's you can see that there's a potential solution to a problem because you just manipulated something and now you see how something works. So think of a gate. You're moving, an animal's moving, and all of a sudden they see the latch fly open, and now through insight you realize, aha, that was connected, and if I disconnect it, I can use that. So that's different from foresight, where you look at the gate and you realize, oh, I understand that's connected, and I disconnect it. Or lots of practice, where you sort of stumble upon the solution, but you don't really understand, either through insight or foresight, the mechanism. So these different types of mental representation allow for a lot of flexibility. And one of the ways to think about mental representation is it's really mental trial and error. You don't actually have to do the behavior to see whether it's going to work or not as a solution. You can sort of reason about it internally. And organisms that have the ability to manipulate stored information, things they remember or they've experienced, and imagine the consequences of different actions, they're going to be allowed to have a lot of flexibility. Now, one of the most important developmental psychologists, Jean Piaget, was the first to sort of coin this idea of mental trial and error. And of course, it allows animals to really flexibly solve different problems. Okay, so let me give you one example of mental trial and error, and then we'll be able to really understand what it is that I'm talking about. So this is a case of a chimpanzee. The video you're going to see is a chimpanzee trying to solve a computer-based task, and you can play along. What's going to happen is that a bunch of numbers are going to flash up on the screen. It's going to be very momentary, and you're going to see Ayumu, the chimpanzee, use mental representation. He's going to very quickly perceive the numbers. He's going to remember them, and then he has to touch them in ascending order in order to receive a food treat. So you have to remember them. You have to remember where they are on the computer screen, and then you have to touch them in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to get your food treat. So see how you do. See how fast you can form mental representations, and if you can keep up with Ayumu. So they're the numbers. They get covered, and you have to remember where you saw them. So every time you hear that bell, that means he was correct. Try to keep up. He's really fast, isn't he? Wow. So this is a great example of mental representation where Ayumu is using his, he's perceiving where in space the different numbers are, but he's mentally representing in his memory where they are, and also their relative value to one another, and then he's able to touch them in the right order in order to get his food reward. So that is mental representation in action. Okay, and so an ecological approach to cognition is very powerful because it helps us think about how animals solve problems in the ecology that they evolved to solve problems in. It helps us understand why would it be that one animal has one type of intelligence or one type of flexibility, whereas another has a different type. So cognitive adaptations evolve in response to unpredictability in an organism's environment. And the idea is that unpredictability can't be overcome by inflexible or innate behavioral strategies, however complex they are. And ecological approach views each species in its own ecology or its own ecological context and tries to evaluate the problems an organism evolved to solve and how they solve them. This is a very different view than how we normally operate when we think about intelligence. And here's where it gets its power, is that function, or the payoff of cognition towards reproduction and towards survival, really guides questions about mechanisms to explore. So, for instance, if you want to understand why it is that an animal, or if you want to identify where an animal might be really sophisticated cognitively, you want to then think about the problems that they have to solve in their daily lives to be successful at surviving and reproducing. And that's where you'd expect to see potentially really interesting cognitive abilities. Okay, so the ecological approach to cognition is therefore completely in opposition to any theoretical perspective suggesting that cognition is one thing. And this is something that many people across lots of different walks of life often fall into the trap, thinking that intelligence is one thing and that you can actually have a number that you could place on me or on you or on your dog and say your dog is smart or your dog is not smart, you are smart or I am smart. That's really not what we find when we look in nature and take this ecological approach to cognition. Intelligence is not unidimensional, and anything that we just might call intelligence, our learning ability, that simply varies across individuals or species quantitatively, is really just not an accurate depiction of animal intelligence, or including us. So, in summary, we're going to put some evolutionary theory together with cognitive theory, and we get the ecological approach. And as one final example of what I'm talking about, this is where the ecological approach is really powerful, is when people ask me the question, and they ask me all the time, which species is smarter? On the left, we have dolphins. On the right, we have a bonobo. And you know, people ask me all the time, is a dolphin smarter than a chimpanzee? Is a chimpanzee smarter than a dolphin? Well, if you take the ecological approach, you know that asking that question is like asking me, which is a better tool, a hammer or a screwdriver? Well, it depends on what problems the animal has experienced in its ecology, what the different relationships of different species it has in its family, and how they've evolved to solve problems, how their cognition develops, and the different mechanisms that they have to solve different problems, all play into thinking about how an animal solves problems. So, which species is smarter? Well, if I'm underwater, I think a dolphin's smarter. If I'm in a tree, I think a bonobo's smarter. So really, it depends on the ecological context. And that's what we're going to do when we think about dog emotion and cognition. We're going to think about the ecology and the evolutionary history of dogs when we're trying to ask the question, why is it that dogs are such genius? How is it that their ecology shaped them to be so successful? So to summarize, cognition produces flexible behavior. Mental representation allows for mental trial and error. Function predicts mechanism. Cognition is favored when an animal ecology favors flexible problem solving over inflexible strategies. And an ecological approach combines evolution and cognitive theories.